Welcome to the Visiting Writers Series with Richard Meier. A couple housekeeping notes. Laptops and devices off, please. We will have a reading, and then we'll have a brief 5-minute little intermission for you to stand, refresh your cookies, your lemonade, and then we'll have a conversation with Rick. And I will also, after the conversation, be wearing my bookseller hat. I have Rick's books available for purchase from Woodland Pattern, a companion, and a duration. So please feel free to browse. Welcome. Good. Okay. Richard Meier is residence here at Carthage College and joins us tonight from sabbatical. He's published 6 books of poetry, including most recently a companion, Wave Books 2025, sister volume to a duration, Wave Books 2023. These sister volumes are composed of daily meditation practice plus notebook writing, observation practices, the non-human world, the human world, the domestic world, the human world, again, the domestic human world, the overlapping world, the theatrical world, the textual world, the dream world. A preliminary checklist and field guide to these worlds must include hawk, crow, sparrow, sharp-shinned hawk, 3 pheasants, starling, diver ducks, seagull, 5 references, and gull, to be more specific. It is nice to see these things again and again. We encountered tundra swan, trumpeter swan, northern shovelers, woodpecker species, finch, cardinal, goldfinch, wood duck, mallards, goldeneye, buffleheads, red-winged blackbird, a dozen robins, Canada geese, magnificent frigate bird. Writing with gratitude words that had migrated through so many bodies, by eye and by ear. Hermit thrush, osprey, loon, northern flicker, kinglet, ringneck duck, black and white warbler, wren, raven, nuthatch, heron, peregrine, catbird, swallows, owls, mergansers. All this is in the text. Squirrel, 7 non-ironic references. Muskrat, sea otter, not to mention friends in the human world. We are all in the text. Hackberry, boxwood, oaks, mulberry, hemlock, fir, red maple, cottonwood, green ash, live oak, spruce, larch. In this present tense that refuses no one. Please welcome Rick Meier.
Thank you, Chuck. That's I think that's definitely the best introduction I will ever get. And I wouldn't know most of those birds and some of those trees without Chuck. We were just talking about, we went down to the Meier Park and the Pike River, and we saw 3 hooded mergansers, which is an incredible bird, and 2 red-headed ducks, and lots of gulls and other things. But the first time Chuck read here, quite a long time ago now, probably 10 or more, dozen years ago, he and I walked down the river and saw snow buntings, which I believe, it was like their first of the year or something that, so Chuck was very excited to see these birds, and I was like, oh, now I know something about Chuck that I did not know. I knew his poetry, and I knew him in the city, in Chicago a little bit, but yeah, to suddenly see a person get super excited about snow buntings, and then have me look at the snow buntings through the binoculars and join a great sort of gallery of poets looking at birds through binoculars that Chuck has, and then a note about what bird they're looking at. So we got to do that again today with the hooded mergansers, who are in a what Niedecker poem were you thinking of?
Thoughts on things unfold above the riverbeds. Yeah.
There we were in the poem. And so those kind of experiences, so I wanted to say first, thank you all for being here so much. It's not easy to be here, ever, wherever here is at that moment. And it's a strange thing. I've been, for months and months, like sitting in a room alone with this writing. I'm going to read a little bit from the book and then a lot of the writing I've been working on. And it feels like a very big place in one way, but it also is a very, in certain way, unpopulated place, at least with flesh and blood people. There's just me and the dog usually. So it's really a great pleasure to share it with some people. So I'm going to start with the beginning of a poem from a companion that's called The Other Cast. And the title refers to how the plays that I've been in, at least in Madison, there would always be multiple casts. So there'd be like, cast A and cast B, and whatever character you played, there'd be somebody in the other cast that also played your character. And so your notion of individuality, I think mine at least, was affected by the sense that, you would just take turns at rehearsal and suddenly the person saying what you said was another person. And you looked different than you thought you looked, and so on. In my case, they were often, 40 years younger than me or something. So a 12-year-old is like doing the same thing I'm doing. But it applies in lots of other ways too. And I'll read the first few pages of this, and also I am happy to read it because those of us that have been here a little longer appears in it that you'll be happy to hear her mentioned. So, The Other Cast. Today I was sitting with these conflicts in a series. What need of one long grass with faint red seed crowns, dandelion very yellow, ragged tulips yesterday, 2 robins by the minivan, 2 yellow warblers in the catkins, a woman in a black lace see-through housecoat over black underwear, descending the stairs, followed by a man in shorts and sunglasses, then both ascending, smiling, the sun shining, in sandy drainage loosened time, drifting by the last day in the beach air at 9:23 in the morning. The left big toe throbs and aches in neon green socks. The left abdomen throbs and aches, each thing voluntarily on the holy antics noun drawings, a hand cupping a penis, a tingling sensation under walking trees, and grackles opening pointed petals. The new shoots on the grapes are soft and green. I don't know where I saw a bumblebee flying in a slow straight line, a tunnel in the air that made me think of the words of an occasion, place, time, circumference, forcing their way into the alphabet. The golden robin subdued oriole, golden-breasted thread puller on the long dry stalk in the stream bed of the culvert yesterday, reached left, then pulled right, thin fibers of the dry stalk, holding each thread deep in the crook of its mouth, visible while it pulled. Another finally flew away, trailing fibers larger than its body for nest building. These are good enough for writing. Day, year came near, turns in my arms, so time has friends, so in time thread is torn loose. The sun shining in my eyes, speaking with Maria on the patio about her writing. The copy of Tiptoe Sought I've given her flopping open on the table. She says she is making notes on puppets and will soon be talking again to her friend, a puppet maker and performer. A ball of chicken wire or a paint rag or a discarded piece of wood or dried lemon may suggest to me the core of an idea for a figure, she says, he said, leading me to a conversation on the train 8 or 9 years before in which she showed how in Ben Jonson's plays, acting leads to unmasking, acting shown to be a lie, producing a satiric effect that pushes the audience away, but now, continuing, she says,
It is also inside the lie the improviser comes alive, a link of difference in truth to Shakespeare, for whom acting is the life of life, drawing the audience close until embodiment, masked or unmasked, joins everyone present. She faced me in the receding landscape, and I faced her in the approaching one. I say, here as I wrote this, the bird song in the bush ended at the moment an oriole emerged. It is only in pretending that the end of pretending comes, ending including the ending of acting and the ending of not acting. In poetry, the ending of language and the ending of the outside of language. No cause in nature, and no cause outside either. The difference between combining and not combining falls flat where a blank concentrates. A double corona around the moon. It looks like a daisy, Elle said, walking out in her nightgown. At the party earlier, the boat, full of water, floated below the surface of the water. Trembled, ached, breathed, hovered, began again, nodded off, began lightening, began inside, recalling the vision requiring these movements, staring down at a milkweed in the process of unfurling its leaves, the open, flat, flopping leaves below the curled, loose, thick, milky, not only when it breaks, bud. How it will spread itself thin, without regret, over the whole landscape. That ends in the middle of a sentence, but it has to end somewhere. And I was happy. My writing makes me happy. The writing that I publish, at least the writing that doesn't make me happy, I don't share. And it's a thing I learned very slowly over the course of my life. I think that like following joy or happiness while I'm writing was a good, it might be about very unhappy things, but there's some peculiar energy in the writing that like makes me keep want to keep going. So I was figuring out something to read from the book, and then I thought, I read the first line of that poem and thought, I like that, I'll read that. And then as I read it, it seemed to include many of the tones and feelings and experiences that I was writing about in the novel that I'm writing, the long fiction that I'm writing, and in the piece that I'm going to read today. And the experience of writing that long fiction is the experience of a sort of expanding sense of here, and an expanding sense of now. I heard a wonderful, I love when you're really in making, wherever you look, something is feeding into what you're trying to make. It's making it for you in a way, whatever you encounter. Like seeing those mergansers, I think. But I was listening to a Dharma talk this morning, as I often do while I do the dishes. And, there's a lot of people, we've got to be present, let's be present. And one of the things the teacher, Gil Fronsdal, who I love his teaching very much, said the past, the present, and the future are always present. He said you can't write a sentence if you're only in a single syllable. You have to sort of extend. There's an extension that happens in both directions in this sort of extended present. And I think a lot of the feeling I've been having in writing in the last 10 or 12 years, which now seems to me like a very short amount of time, like the present, the 10 years of the present, is that sense that can expand and at the same time that I get really like, I didn't do enough today, like get so attached to that as the present or something. But when you're writing a really long thing, the oldest things I wrote in this, I wrote 20 years ago. Not that I've been writing it for 20 years, but I've picked it up and put it down in various ways and writing it intensively for the last 3 years and 6 years and 7 the feeling that like the present just gets bigger and bigger, and the place of the present gets bigger, and the here gets bigger and bigger. So anyway, I thought I'm going to read 2 chapters, starting on page 509. So I can't tell you everything that happens before these chapters, and I'm not going to try. But for some reason, these are the 2 chapters that I felt like I could read a relatively short section and give you a feeling for it. It's called A Glass Planet, the novel, or long fiction, and you'll get to hear why in this chapter. And the main character is Leopold. He lives in Chicago, sort of. He doesn't really know. Who can say where you really live, as somebody tells him in the book. But he also has traveled to Italy, where he's met a person, and then he's gone back there to the mountains in Italy, where he spends time with her, but maybe not as much as he was hoping, and walks around in the mountains a lot alone. So that's probably enough of a setup. Okay. And then after the, you can tell me, you can ask questions, you can think, you can tell me about what you're doing, whatever happens. So, on the day Leopold climbed from Zapata and over the Passo del Arco to the west of Col de Mugi, he looked for the first time into the high valley on the far side of the pass and saw no towns, only forest and mountains and the Rio Sierra de Zapata river. He followed the trail east toward Monte Sierra and into the high valley, around the southern side of the Col de Mugi. He passed a single woman with a large dog standing off to one side and nodded as he passed. Soon after, looking up and down the trail to be sure he was alone, he duck-walked through a hole in a stand of stone piles, shrugging off the branches that clawed at his pack, and climbed into a dry stream bed, searching for an isolated place to sit, safely out of sight of the trail where he'd encountered the woman and her dog. He tucked himself into the half-shade on the white bowl of smooth stone at the bottom of a dry waterfall and sat for 23 minutes with his eyes closed, and then a few minutes with his eyes and notebook open, when the thought that once again weeks had passed since he had spoken to anyone appeared, and he recorded it by noting that he'd walked up the dry bed from the grove to this place where he'd felt the flies walk 5 breaths across the back of his hand or cheek, the sun come and go on his lower legs, the wind start as a sound in a larch or spruce before arriving moments later at his bare hands and face, the clouds and sound together, a cool gliding sensation in which whatever thoughts he'd been having had come undone. He noted that the waterfall he'd told himself was dry wasn't completely dry. Ants walked on the edge of the lichen where the rust-colored water seeped out of the white limestone face. He touched his own face, bending the whiskers without touching the skin. A golden eagle hovered over the canyon. He saw it when he opened his eyes, noticing at the same time that he had closed them when he touched his face. He sat up straighter, then leaned back and slid down until a curve in the rock pressed into the base of his neck as he looked up. The golden eagle hung very still in the funneled updraft, and he studied how the constant fine adjustments of wings and body as it passed from one posture to another while remaining in place was an element of its stillness. As he studied the golden eagle, he recalled that Freesia had said that when she climbed the spruce as a young girl, the tip of the tree had swayed in the breeze as she looked along and then across the Piave and imagined the river was fluttering like a green ribbon in the hair of a girl like her. A few moments later, he recalled that she had told him, as she looked up from her window in Zapata toward Monte Sierra, that this might be the high alpine valley, or a high alpine valley, that led to the high alpine valley she had seen beyond the Piave from the top of the spruce. He He wondered if on his walk he might encounter a place where a gap in the mountains would allow him to look across the valley or valleys over the river that had once waved like a green ribbon in a girl's hair in the mind of a girl at the top of a spruce in Colonetta, and even to understand that in the fictional past tense, which he understood to be the present unfolding in another place, she was at the tip of the spruce looking toward him, along the golden line she had imagined between the valley where he was and the tree where she had been. A day he'd been taken by Miss Arbuckle, that's his second grade teacher, to one of what were called in his elementary school's satellite libraries, followed this sequence into the periphery of his mind. There were no books in the satellite libraries. Instead, each was a kind of theater, formed by steps, narrow on either edge and broad enough to serve as seats in the center, descending from the hallway near the midpoint of each of what were called the building's north and south wings. Students from the north and south wings rarely saw one another, as if they lived in two valleys divided by a mountain range. At the base of the stairs, there was a space for a speaker to stand, or a teacher to draw back the dark orange curtain that covered the screen on which films were projected from the 16mm projector Miss Arbuckle had taught the child Leopold to operate. The narrow and broad stairs and the walls were all covered in the same dark green carpet. On the day whose images were returning to Leopold, rather than as a group to see a film or listen to a speaker, the students were being taken one by one from the classroom to the satellite library to be questioned. They were being questioned about a boy in their class, Bobby Dusso, who that day or the day before had left the playground at recess, crossed the sloping driveway the students were not allowed to cross, where the school buses and the teachers' cars entered the parking lot behind the school, and disappeared into the woods. Having disappeared into the woods, he had reappeared, naked, in the yellow-green needles of a white pine that looked down on the playground and the school. Leopold did not recall seeing or speaking to anyone who had seen Bobby Dusso disappear into the woods or reappear naked high in a tree. In some way, Leopold could not recall. The child Leopold had learned what had happened and formed, though perhaps the image had not appeared in words like these until years later, while the teenaged Leopold was trying to write a poem that included the image he saw at the edge of his mind of a boy's tiny white naked body high in the green needles of a white pine. Leopold saw it there again now, behind Frisia's flickering white legs as she climbed the spruce. Leopold realized then that when Frisia had told him the story of climbing the spruce, he had combined the image forming in his mind from her words with the image of the naked body of Bobby Dusso in the white pine, and seen the legs of the child Frisia flickering whitely, as if they were bare as she climbed the spruce. He tried to correct this image in his mind to the flickering tallow white of her face and hair and a sweater of the same color, or a dirty, flickering white t-shirt if the day was warm, above the dark blue of the jeans she would have worn day after day as she climbed the trees and wandered the forest. The dirty or tallow white and dark blue were matte and soft between the shiny dark needles and the bright blue and white of the sky showing here and there between the branches. Miss Arbuckle was telling the child Leopold they were concerned about Bobby and were asking all the children if they had any idea why he had run away and climbed the tree. Leopold could not recall her mentioning that Bobby Dusso had taken off his clothes, though the child Leopold added that detail silently as she spoke and assumed both he, the child Leopold, and Miss Arbuckle knew of, but should not speak of, Bobby Dusso's nakedness. As he recalled her question, and as the child Leopold heard her question, Leopold seemed to see the blue light of a police car at the base of the tree from which the naked boy in the topmost branches must have been looking down. He did not know what the child Leopold saw or heard. The child Leopold had told Miss Arbuckle that he did not know why Bobby had climbed the tree. He may also have told her that sometimes other children picked on Bobby, though he, the child Leopold, may only have thought this and been afraid to say it, not wanting to seem to be one of those who had picked on Bobby Dusso. If the child Leopold had told her, and she had subsequently asked why they had picked on Bobby, Leopold believed the child Leopold would have said he did not know, At the same time, he would have been thinking of the dirty red and blue coat Bobby never took off, the oily dark hair and yellow teeth, and the tiny rundown house on a dark street at the edge of the town forest, where the bus picked him up shortly before arriving each day at the new school, built on what had then been the poor side and remained the poorer side of town, and would have felt a mix of pride and shame. Pride that he had not been one of the children that picked on Bobby, and shame that he had not befriended him or told the others to stop. The street on which the child Leopold's family had lived, and where Leopold's parents still lived, had been chosen to represent the line the school committee had decided would divide the town and indicate which children would attend the new school on the poor or poorer side of town, and which would attend the old brick school near the harbor on the rich or richer side of town. The house of his friends Terry and Ryan had been on the latter side of the street, and so the other side of town, and so they had continued to attend the older brick school near the harbor, while the child Leopold, whose house had been determined to belong to the poorer side of town, had attended the new inland school and seen the brothers less and less until they moved away, after which he saw them only 2 more times, on the occasions described elsewhere in this fiction. On the bus to Zapata that morning, the words, "the thousand transitions the flesh is heir to," had popped into Leopold's mind, and here were the clouds moving very fast with loose, fine, dangling edges, same as the larch. An ant was climbing a wrinkle on his shirt. He flicked it off. The strange roar he'd earlier taken for thunder was a jet, white, high, passing over an event he couldn't recall seeing or hearing in the weeks in the valley containing San Pietro, Presanaio, Mare, Campolongo, and Santo Stefano, though he'd once seen and heard a pair of military jets over San Pietro disappear behind Terza Piccolo with a roar. He watched the line of ants in the dry bed as a way to think of his thoughts someday coming together. There were small pools from yesterday's rain, the seep on the rocks behind him, and drips in 3 places from the tufts of grass at the rock edge, bright with gentian above the opening in the cliff face that led to a trail. He walked back down the dry stream bed and through the hole in the stone pines to the trail and began to descend. The dry stream bed dropped rapidly beside the trail to the bottom of a gorge and was soon 100 or more feet below the steep path. After an hour of walking along the winding fat path down the face of Col de Mugi, he reached the high valley where the dry stream bed met the Rio Sierra de Zapata. A rough log bridge brought him over it. He picked his way upstream and sat with his feet in the cold water, thrilled by the small world of the bridge seen between 2 boulders. It became a version of the hanging scroll by Tang Di he'd visited 3 or 4 times in the Metropolitan Museum, first with Celia, his friend who's a painter, and then 2 or 3 times alone. The scroll showed in black ink images of the trees, rocks, clouds, and mountains towering over and around 2 tiny figures in a high valley, one sitting, one walking. The peaks of the mountains and the valley below the high valley were lost in the mist, through a break in which a distant ridge appeared. The ink painting had been described on the didactic next to it as the illustration of the poem written directly on the scroll, whose 2 figures, when he had read the translation, became 1 figure, occupying 2 places in time, or 2 times in 1 place. I walk to where the water ends and sit and watch as clouds arise. Leopold watched the stream hit the 2 boulders and divide into 4 distinct passages over and over. Climbing on one boulder, he saw how they both sloped down in the direction of the stream's flow. At the downstream edge, the tops of the boulders were partially submerged and harbored plants with small white and yellow flowers, rich green and brown moss, vibrating grasses. He pictured a tiny version of himself, kneeling in the moss between the white and yellow flowers and the vibrating grasses, and looking up at a forest of white and yellow trees and green and brown meadows, above which tall green firs vibrated in the wind coming down from the bare rock of the mountain. Freesia sat swaying on top of one, Bobby Duso in another, and Terry and Ryan in a third. Content with his walk, neither fearing nor hoping he was near the end of the loop in the village, He followed the path as it hugged the cliff on the stream's far side. As the high valley narrowed into a chasm 100 meters or more deep, the river raced between the two mountains. Kilometers apart at the peak, the mountains were a body's width apart where the river ran. He thought of the mountains as touching. In places, the river disappeared below ground, only to be divided again when the water roared as it leapt into view and shattered on a boulder wedged in the narrow channel. For a time, the twists of the path hid the river from him, and he feared it had gone underground forever. He entered the forested slopes and walked between the trees, recalling how the river had flowed between the mountains. When the stream returned, flowing almost silently between the banks of loam, he seemed to himself a solid and heavy thing again, so large it became difficult to move. He soaked in the icy water where the stream and the river joined, naked, he told himself, as Bobby do so in the white pine, hidden by oleander bushes growing on a high bank, from the people he heard passing just behind them on the paved path. 15. Some days later, seeing a woman at the bus stop in Santo Stefano, baffled by an automated voice he heard issuing from her phone, he thought of the river between the mountains and wanted to visit it with Friscia and asked her to point across the valley to the spruce and colonnetta. The spine of the baffled woman curved sharply forward, so he saw the back of her head as she spoke again into the phone, and then her face as she rotated her head and looked up at him and shook her head. It wasn't answering her questions, she seemed to be telling him. He heard the Italian words repeating, seeming to ask her to push one button or another on her phone, regardless of what she said in response to the synthesized voice she seemed to take or to refuse not to take as belonging to a flesh and blood person. Holding the phone away from her face, she whispered to Leopold, "San Pietro." He nodded. She led him to a smaller bus he hadn't taken before. A placard in the front read Contralto. He mouthed his thanks, then followed her on board. As the bus proceeded up the valley through Campolongo and toward Mare, one passenger and then another spoke to the driver, requesting stops in front of houses not marked with signs reading Fermata a Richiesta. The bus turned off the main road in Mare before his usual stop in Presinaio and climbed toward Contralta. Leopold grew nervous as it climbed the steep winding road, afraid it wouldn't stop in San Pietro, but the bus turned off the winding road and stopped in the Piazza Poli del Pol. The woman who had directed him to the bus reached above her line of sight and pulled herself up by one of the dangling loops. Leopold stood up too, pleased that they were getting off together and that in the future he would nod to her and smile, and she would nod in return, both of them remembering the day he had shared a sympathetic look with her as the automated message ignored her queries, and she had taught him that the bus to Contralta stopped in San Pietro. Leopold watched while the bus circled the piazza and continued on its way. He thanked her again softly as she walked slowly north across the piazza on the west toward Via Mazzaterra, while he walked north on the east side toward Via Marconi on the winding route to Via del Popolo in the Finial. The Finial is like a kind of converted barn that he lives in. The moon was a few days past full and still had one rough edge, as if Leopold was holding his eye too close to it to bring it into focus. A gray tabby poked its head through an iron fence sealed off with chicken wire. As he walked past, conscious of not staring at the tabby, but also of not looking away, the tabby yanked its head back and disappeared into the bank of thistle that grew in the yard. Searching for the key in his pocket, he had been unable to learn how to prevent the door from locking automatically when it closed. The small phone vibrated against the back of his hand. He answered, and Friscia told him the child was playing on the floor, stacking the blocks and wobbling along with the tower, falling over with them when they fell and laughing like crazy. She told him that now that she was back from the south, there was so much to do at the pizzeria and in the garden, the days flew by. He said he could see in silhouette a blackbird on a chimney cap, to which she replied, to his surprise, with the kind of story he was longing to hear. She told him that one day, on a walk in the forest behind Colonnetta, she'd remembered that when she was a child, she'd found a glass ball inside a hollow tree. She didn't know why she'd put her hand in the hollow at the base of the tree. She just had a feeling she should. The inside of the tree was soft from the wood dust that had sprinkled down as the insects chewed the heartwood. As she dug her hand into the wood dust, she told him she felt something smooth and wrapped her fingers around it, amazed at the size and smoothness of the surface, and drew out a ball of solid, clear glass 2 or 3 times the size of a large marble, whose center was a mix of blues and greens and browns with swirls of white above them. She told him it had seemed to her to be a planet no one had ever seen, however much it was like a model of this planet. A local artist made them in various sizes, her mother had explained, and everyone called them glass planets. But no one could explain to her why she'd found the glass planet, which she learned would have cost 50 or 100 euros in the artist's shop in the hollow at the base of a tree. When they asked her, she couldn't explain to them what she put her hand in. She had been 8 or 9 years old, and she remembered lying awake at night and thinking of explanations, that her parents had put the glass planet there, that the artist had hidden it for a special person to find, that an animal had carried it for some mysterious reason to the nest it had made in the base of the hollow tree, that someone had dropped it on the trail and it had rolled into the hollow. As she imagined them night after night, she told him, she began to see the explanations as semi-transparent events laid one on top of another, a more and more complete picture that included all the possible events joining forces, as she used to think of it, to guide the glass ball into the hollow, and her to slide her hand in and find it. She told him that although she couldn't stop going back to the explanations, it seemed to her she had been hoping there was no explanation, or none that had occurred to her yet. When the explanation finally arrived, as she had believed but no longer believed it would be an explanation no one, including her, could have imagined. He said it was the story he was longing to hear. He meant for her to understand this, to declare his love for her, as she seemed to have understood that to him, her story of the glass ball found inside the hollow tree was a response to this declaration, though his declaration, in the form of telling her it was the story he had been longing to hear, had followed her response, given in the form of the story she told him. His declaration to her seemed to him a response to the trust she had been showing by telling him the story of the glass planet. She told him she was glad he liked the story and that she was going to say goodbye now. As he held the phone pressed tightly to his ear, his knuckles pressed into his warm cheek, the absence of any sound from the phone's speaker told him the connection had ended. A tree rattled, leaves fell, and a wood pigeon burst out from the branches, knocking more leaves to the ground. As the swooping bird flapped its wings, the tips touched above and below its body. He recalled a kind of folk poem or nursery rhyme in the book he was reading, a biography of Soren Kierkegaard by Joachim Garf, translated from the German by Bruce H. Kermsey. A hunter blew hard into his horn, and everything he blew was lost. The strong feeling that had risen in him that what he had not said to Frisia had nevertheless been received by her seemed to answer the fear in the poem that whatever became a sound was lost. The poem also gave him pause as he considered how close he had come to speaking words that might have thus been lost. He imagined the glass planet blown out of the horn and rolling beneath the tree, the horn trying to call the glass planet home, not knowing it had been rightly claimed by a young girl who had put her hand into the hollow of the tree for a reason neither she nor anyone had yet imagined or understood. He saw the scroll of Tang Di hanging in the Metropolitan Museum, the man walking in a high valley where the trees, rocks, clouds, and mountains towered over and around him, while the peaks and low valley were both lost in the mist through a break in which a distant ridge appeared, was also the sitting man, the curling, branching strokes of whose writing was just then forming the trees, rocks, clouds, and mountains, towering over and around the walking man and him, while the peaks and low valleys were both lost in the mist through a break in which a distant ridge appeared. Leopold saw in his mind the 2 boulders in the Rio Sierra de Zapata. Both boulders sloped in the direction of the stream's flow, the low downstream edges harboring plants with small white and yellow flowers, rich green and brown moss, and vibrating grasses, while he himself knelt at the base of one of the mountains that formed the valley and looked up and into a forest of white and yellow trees, green and brown meadows and tall green firs vibrating in the wind. All the images, he supposed, might be contained inside the glass planet Freesia had told him the story of finding in the hollow space at the base of the tree, one of many drawn by a single twisting stroke of Tang Di's brush. He opened the kitchen window wide and focused his eyes on the peak of Terza Piccola. Because of the steep slope the finial rested on, as he looked out over the narrow Piave River valley to the steep and forested slope on the far side that rose to the peak, he could tilt his head slightly and see only sky, the bare rock of the mountain, and the silhouettes of the few trees growing on the grassy shoulder. At the same time, he heard the river flowing past and considered how, at the time when Freesia and her child would have joined him in the finial, he and Freesia would sit and talk in low voices, half hidden by the sound of the river from the child, who slept or lay awake alone for the first time in the next room, hearing them without seeing them or understanding what they said. At that time, he, Leopold, would picture the solitary child not yet asleep, while seeing images in his mind of the child Leopold, with the ghost pipe or lady's slipper orchid, the 14-year-old Leopold sitting alone with his mother in the hospital room where she had told him it hurt so much she wanted to die. His mother alone and wanting to die, forming, he supposed, in her mind, in her struggles, the sentence she would speak to him when he arrived. And Gerard Manley Hopkins, alone in front of the page on which he was writing the poem in which Margaret, as she was mourning the Golden Grove on leaving, was mourning Margaret. Leopold would ask Freesia if the child would be all right in the room alone for the first time. And then when Freesia stood up for a moment to check on the child, and after some minutes returned to report the child had been singing to himself, and then, as she watched, and without noticing her presence, he had fallen asleep peacefully, as she separately told both Leopold and the child he would. Leopold would finally understand that the horror and pity he had often felt when he pictured another person alone had been misplaced. Thank you. And now we're going to take a couple minutes for
Yeah, why don't we do so that
a drink and
yeah,
a cookie, and
folks
then
can
we talk
get a
about it.
refreshment, and then do you want to stand and talk, or do you want?
I think I'll pull a chair around.
Yeah, that sounds good. Please feel free to grab from the refreshments.
which was like actually classic.
So this, the companion, can you
Like
show
I
us?
did,
This is the
just
one.
took a bunch of
This is Spider-Man.
blocks that are
This is the earliest, so
Oh,
he's
yes.
still writing,
Yes.
you know, still making.
one of the
He was beautiful. Now we have to wait.
When I did it again, I did it with James and his friend, and we took 2 days. And
Well, like they should recast Francesca and Gregory, and I'm like, bro, they're like 18 right now. They're gonna be like 30 by the time this
Oh, yeah.
actually comes out. Like,
I haven't like written about it so much.
yeah. They'll be fine. Like, don't take away their jobs. Like, just. Yeah. Not Francesca, Hyacinth.
Yeah.
No, she jokes out. Yeah, but then yeah, that's gotta show off.
Yeah. They would
Yeah, you gotta take the
Yeah.
consider
Oh, yeah.
that song or something.
I'm very
Especially the choices. And then I'll be like, okay, this is
No, I forget.
Oh, great.
I wrote this in another one of my
and
students.
hopefully I'll.
I just keep yapping. About TV shows, I think. But,
You're gonna
I
do
used
the
to,
poll?
I forgot to forget.
There we go.
My cousins call me.
Yeah, see if I next don't know how to do that.
Okay, good.
Well, it would be like a vacation.
Sometimes I forget that
Like,
like,
write poetry. That's what I feel like.
not that great.
So free is right there.
Oh, yeah.
Bridgerton, and then like they can't end up together. And it's like, bro, Bridgerton is a lovely fantasy world where everything is fine and happy.
Yeah, exactly.
They cured racism, they cured classism, now they're gonna cure homophobia.
Yeah.
Okay, they're gonna solve all the problems. They're just, and you know what? I'm here for that. Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't answer your email in space.
Oh,
I'm glad we figured it out.
I was like, I'm sure the website, and I was gonna went for it, that's the thing, that website too. And then once I was like, okay.
Yeah.
I probably remember that.
You know, Jay makes it worthwhile, you know.
watch it.
He sees his return on that. This is what happens.
Yes, no, we had that.
That's relative.
I know.
I mean, art is better than.
Daredevil and Spider-Man, only Marvel things that make me go right now. Oh my god. They're just so ashamed of themselves.
Where's that box?
Just slipped it back here. Yeah.
I'm gonna get two for one. Cause I just want, this is the first book, so we have like a more research. Oh, look, that one's already signed.
Oh, wow. Look at that.
Shall I inscribe? Is that okay?
Please,
Okay, yeah, some people are like, oh.
Yeah. No, I got to tell this one lady at my job, at retail, so, I was like, cause her son was talking about Spider-Man or something, I was like, there's Spider-Man movie in July, cause I'm crazy.
Yeah.
No, I can never relate to like normal people's interests, but then when they're kids by boys, I'm like, oh my god, I can tell you all about Marvel superheroes as a little child.
Bears.
They don't have the same extent I do. They never will.
Yeah.
Like, the same extent. It's so crazy. Yeah. Insane. They're back in 2020.
I was trying to talk about Bluey with this one lady.
Oh, you're
Like,
right.
This one I'll just.
this one lady would like, she made a face when I said I like movies. Like she did, just like, it's cute.
Thank you. Yeah, no,
Yeah, she
free time.
Yeah,
And like
I think so for sure.
yeah, like my mom was talking about like like I know the first year like it was kind of the first time I opened it. Like it impacted her for sure. But
There's so many.
like, that's what I'm estimating. It's just like the food for food.
Yeah. I think food is the most of it. I feel like Stratford is other gives you buying
Yes.
from his place.
Yeah.
I don't know if your place is gonna be as
I feel like very said Disney also like
Yeah.
they just put it the same. Like Disney, a lot of stores. I spent
good on towards the place. That's like every single
About to
place
put
is
my
the
glass.
same.
yeah.
Yeah.
Like I spent
Good
was
I
idea.
realize like I'm allowed to again, like, oh, I guess.
I did the same thing. Yeah.
and I'm just like, oh, I already bought this.
I've already seen all these stuff.
Yeah. You know.
Okay.
So I spent less.
All right. I think everybody's back. I'm gonna save my voice and use this microphone. So, I would love to answer questions or hear your complaints or your comments or associations. It may be somebody else found something amazing under a tree once, or someplace else. Yeah, so anything you'd like to say or ask?
When'd you start writing? Sure. I guess I started writing when I was probably 15 in a way that I felt like, or at least when I was 15, I decided like I'm going to be a poet. I don't fully understand, under the influence of Anne Sexton and Jim Morrison, I decided to become a poet. And then William Carlos Williams and Wallace Stevens and Jack Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg and lots of people. Yeah. So I just started doing it. It's a mysterious question to me, like why I was so committed to that idea, and it's definitely a thing. Like even at some point, it became mysterious. Like at that point, it was just like, for whatever reason, I didn't have a question about it. I don't know. Yeah. Yeah. Amen.
What would you say is the biggest difference between writing long fiction and more like observational, poetic, non-fictional kind of works?
That's a great question that I feel. I mean, I think there are parts of this long fiction that are more observational. The part I read is like intensely patterned, and like all these different things that sort of like come together in these recursive and these shifts of scale. And I definitely read that chapter in a way because it describes to me in some way my experience of writing the book or writing long fiction. Like that image when Freesia, who found the glass ball below the tree, so the secret of that, I'll tell you, is that like this is a thing I did, not as a child, but as like an adult, where I just like decided to stick my hand under a tree on a hike in the forest, and there was this like giant glass planet thing that some local artist made, and it's like no idea why it was there or why I stuck my hand under the tree. And the mystery of, like at some point I decided to put that story in and I wrote it up. It felt like it was going to be one of Leopold's experiences, but then it was very clear to me that it was not his, but hers. So that was like a strange thing that happens in fiction, like that it was another thing. But the way she has all these explanations for it, and they're laid over each other like these sort of transparencies that build up towards what seems like it will be a more complete explanation, but also that one can't imagine the explanation that it's going to add up to. That's like a figure for what it's like. Like at first I just put all these things together, but as I do it more and more, to me, for it to feel like a long fiction, I
I need to feel the connection between all the parts in a closer, in a different way than when I write poetry, where I still feel the connection, but there's something looser about it, maybe. And the other thing is just like all I do every day, I'm sitting at my desk at 7 in the morning and I walk the dog and whatever, and then at 7:30 at night I eat dinner. It's like that's what I do, and then so I'm like pretty much living in that world in a different way. So I don't know what really happened and what I just wrote. I don't always know what. Yeah, I can't separate very clearly all the time. But it's a great question. Yeah.
This feels like a fitting question since the class that I took with you was embodied reading.
Yeah.
But sometimes when I write something that I'm like happy or proud of and I try to read it to someone, I feel like the meaning doesn't get conveyed or doesn't translate the same as like when I read it to myself silently in my head.
Sure.
What advice would you say you would have to help myself become more comfortable with like my voice as connected to the things that I write, if that makes sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think to just, rather than thinking, this might sound a little funny because I really want to connect to the people in the room, but that I focused just on feeling connected to the writing, and it was the same thing I learned about doing Shakespeare. It wasn't don't think about the audience, just think about the language, be there for the language, and in a way and also the other thing I think that is really helpful and is to not really even think of it as yours. Now it's just a text you've been given, and then you're allowed to love it. If you're just thinking oh, I wrote this and how are people going to judge it, the temptation is to sort of hate it, right? Just like when you walk into a party and you're thinking oh, about yourself, then you hate yourself. I'm talking about me. But if I forget myself, then I can have fun in some way, and the text is the equivalent of the party in that case. And maybe long fiction is more like a party, and I've been afraid of parties my whole life, so maybe this is also a facing of a fear. I didn't ever think of that, but that's so yeah, I think because you were really good at, you were amazing at embodied reading.
Yeah.
At doing these performed reads, but when you read your own work, what do you find is difficult about it?
I guess there's probably just an inherent doubt, because there's when I'm reading something, it's this is this pre-established classic thing versus something that I just wrote. There's a question of how do I know this thing is good?
Yeah.
There's the inherent doubt that you almost have to overcome, and then be there's no way to really know if this is good. It is a thing that exists, and I should just treat it as that.
Yeah, there's a great Frank O'Hara poem where he says something the only thing you can know is you did it.
Exactly.
You don't. There's something you don't get. So there is definitely you have some faith in something. And as far as not getting too hung up on meaning, making sure people understand what you mean, partially by knowing that you don't know entirely what you mean, and that eventually, which isn't to say you don't care, you care intensely, the meanings that are emerging, but you might learn something when you're reading it. And the other thing I'd say is a great thing about reading to other people, which I find even if I'm just reading to 2 or 3 friends, and then I go look at the text again, boy, that sharpens the mind about what it is. If it's just for you, you sort of can skip over in some way the parts, what it sort of supposed to say or supposed to feel like, but it's, so it is really great, especially even if it's just to one other person. If you have one other person that you trust to listen and not to even do anything but listen and say that's great. They don't need to fix it or yeah.
Hi. Listening to your writings and the podcast and everything, a lot of your writing centers around nature, from scenery and animals and specifically birds. My question question is what do birds mean to you and your writing?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question. I was thinking when Chuck mentioned the squirrels, somebody once asked me, like, boy, so do you feel like you know a lot more about squirrels now that you've written this book? And I had to like say sort, you know, in some way, like I spend a lot of, I think the thing about birds is they are the wild creature that we see most often and hear most often and can encounter. You can just walk outside in the city, or sit inside, like, and birds are present, right? So it's not that I'm, and I'll also, you know, in the Wallace Stevens poem, 13 Ways of Looking at a Blackbird, something like, you know, the only thing moving in the landscape was the eye of the blackbird or whatever. And it does feel like because the idea when I started writing the books, the poems that end up being in those books, I didn't want to sit inside and write anymore. It felt like something had broken in that, and I was stuck inside a kind of echo chamber of books. So I said, oh, I'm only going to write while I'm walking around outside, and I'm only going to write down things that tell me to write them down. So the most basic answer would be like the birds told me to write them down. You know? So they're not chosen to mean something other than that they're just there. Yeah. But I thank you for like noticing that. You know, that means a lot. Thanks. Yes.
I've got a two-part question, I guess. First, do you know what it is about mountains that you love so much, I suppose? And then second, what have you been reading?
Yeah, thank you. Those questions kind of go together, actually. I've always felt drawn to mountains as far back as I can remember. I grew up in New England, not far from mountains, but not in the mountains. I grew up on the ocean, but close to the White Mountains in New Hampshire. We go there. In the part I read where it mentions this Kierkegaard biography that I was reading, near that poem about the hunter and his horn, it talks about Kierkegaard walking and saying like that he only could walk happily in mountain landscapes because the land would come up and meet him. Like a flat land there's like too much space in some way, so a mountain has the quality of conversation. Like it's there, it's like right there. You go up a really steep mountain, and like as you're walking, like the ground is just right in front of your face in some way. So it's like a sort of living landscape that you're, because I think it's not so much the top of mountains that I love, it's like the going up and being in the mountain in some way. So it's that kind of closeness, I think, that I find so appealing. And maybe I'm struggling with this, like the desire to see the other side is a thing like my whole life. I feel like the notion that there's something just out of sight, and mountains sort of embody that in this way. And then, can I read you a little bit of Jude the Obscure? So I've been on a big Thomas Hardy kick. I'm living in the 19th century, that's the other, which has been very exciting. So I got very excited this morning. I wish the reading had been, like instead of 6 at night, it should have been at 6 in the morning. Like that's when I'd be most functional, sadly. But I started writing this whole thing based on this passage in Thomas Hardy that I wanted to share with you. And part of it was about, I was thinking about rereading, so I'm rereading. I mostly love to reread books at this point in my life. But with something, like sometimes they're books that I read in high school and then reread them. It's like the chasm between when you first read it and now is amazing. But also like I reread Jude the Obscure, which I won't spoil the ending, but let's just say somehow I suppressed the horror of the ending when I read it 15 years ago, and I was like, what? You know, like, it was very upsetting. But also, there's this thing that happens with time that is another thing this whole book is about, which has to do with the way things do not happen. Simply put, things don't happen to you in the order that they happen in some objective span of time, right? So if you think of time as place, like you might go to places out of order, you don't go to them in the right order or something. So you might read, D.H. Lawrence and then read Thomas Hardy. And you're like, boy, Thomas Hardy was really influenced by D.H. Lawrence, right? Even though D.H. Lawrence came after Thomas Hardy. And so I might even think, boy, Thomas Hardy was really influenced by me. And this book hasn't even been published yet. So that is amazing. But there's also something in it that feels like true, and also about all the versions, like there's this rereading of the self in some way in memory that happens. The child, Leopold, the 14-year-old, like there's all these different versions of this person. Okay. So when I came upon this passage, which I wanted to share a little bit with you, I'll just read it and then see what I might want to say about it. It's right near the beginning of the book. So he's a child. Jude is a child. Not far from the road stood a weather-beaten old barn of reddish gray brick and tile. It was known as the Brown House by the people of the locality. One of the great, I'm reading a biography too, like Hardy's books are, he lived his youth in a pretty small area, and the book is just full of like the stories of that place. So like a very small feature of the land, like a pond, would have its own story, a little tiny pond. You know, oh, that's the pond where so-and-so drowned, or demons came out of that pond, or like a cow got stuck, or whatever it might be. So each place had its own, these kind of stories. So in a way, he's like collecting these stories. So I love the Brown House. He was about to pass it when he perceived a ladder against the eaves, and the reflection that the higher he got, the further he could see, led Jude to stand and regard it. On the slope of the roof, two men were repairing the tiling. He turned into the ridgeway and drew towards the barn. When he had wistfully watched the workmen for some time, he took courage and ascended the ladder till he stood beside them. Well, my lad, and what may you want up here? I wanted to know where the city of Christminster is, if you please. Christminster is out there by that clump. You can see it, at least you can on a clear day. No, you can't now. The other tiler, glad of any kind of diversion from the monotony of his labor, had also turned to look towards the quarter designated. You can't see it often in weather like this, he said. The time I've noticed it is when the sun is going down in a blaze of flame, and it looks like, I don't know what. The heavenly Jerusalem, suggested the serious urchin. Though I should never have thought of it myself, but I can't see no Christminster today. The boy strained his eyes also, yet neither could he see the far-off city. So he really wants to go to Oxford, which is Christminster in this book, as I understand it. But the place of learning, he's like a poor kid, and he's like studying Latin and Greek on his own and wants to like become, so he wants to see this place. So that's this other thing about mountains that was so interesting, like that it's going to give you this view, like understanding of where you are in the world and where you should be. And then a little bit later, just on the next page, but at the bottom of the next page, I just want to read this bit where he climbs up again. So he climbs up again on the ladder. He then seated himself again. The men had gone home and waited. In the course of 10 or 15 minutes, the thinning mist dissolved altogether from the eastern horizon, as it had already done elsewhere. And about a quarter of an hour before the time of sunset, the westward clouds parted, the sun's position being partially uncovered, and the beams streaming out in visible lines between two bars of slaty cloud. The boy immediately looked back in the old direction. Some way within the limits of the stretch of landscape, points of light like the topaz gleamed. The air increased in transparency with the lapse of minutes, till the topaz points showed themselves to be the vanes, windows, wet roof slates, and other shining spots upon the spires, domes, freestone work, and varied outlines that were faintly revealed. It was Christminster, unquestionably, either directly seen or miraged in the peculiar atmosphere. I'll stop there. Like that sentence, it was Christminster, unquestionably. And then he says, either as itself or just as a mirage in the clouds, like as if they're both unquestionably Christminster, is a completely amazing moment. And I'm now just realizing like another, I've had that experience of being on a mountain and kind of scared in the sleet and stuff, and then suddenly the clouds cleared just enough that I could see the roads shining down below, and the tops of houses and things, and like it was like a map that was lit up. That's quite like that experience, and then it gets covered up, which is also like the scroll and the mist, and so this opportunity in reading something like that, and then writing something like this, and then having experiences in the world, you can feel so close to things that are so far away from you in some way, like so close to Thomas Hardy. You can feel so close to a mountain in Italy, you know, I can feel so close to you all just because I read it to you, and sort of like, you know, I don't know how much it comes across, but Leopold, this character, like he says to Frisha, oh, that's the story I wanted to hear. And in his mind, he's thinking like, oh, I just told her I love her. I didn't actually say that because you really shouldn't say things out loud, you know, because it's dangerous. And that's like, there's something of that experience too, I think. Like, it's like a very intimate, you know, I think about, there's like the anxiety of influence, you've probably heard that idea. And I was telling Lewis and Jordan, like Lisa, oh, I just want to call it the intimacy of influence. That it's one becomes intimate, and that's how one is influenced, you know. And so that there's some strange thing about mountains that allow you to come close to things, like huge things and small things at the same time. Sorry, that's a too long an answer. Maybe we should stop or have one more question, if somebody has one. Okay, Shannon, one more question.
But I want to
Professor
defer if
Bennett.
there's a student, then I want to make sure that they have time too.
And I'll be briefer with the response. Okay.
Well, I was, first of all, thank you so much for your long answers and your long questions, which is maybe a good way of describing the work you shared. And in the chapel class, we've been working a lot on like how you make big things out of little things, or thinking about writing as assembly. And you described for us a little bit about like what it's like to be in a room, right? Or what it's like to kind of make a little thing that becomes bigger. But I was wondering if you might be willing to share a little bit about, once you have some little things, like how you like to approach the act of assembly, or how you like to approach the act of turning the little things that were built in time into something that has a different shape.
Yeah, that's a very exciting part of it for me. Lately, what I feel like has been happening, which you could hear in this section, is that by just reading it sort of over and over, I'll be like, oh my God, that is so connected to this. Who knew? You know, not me, not till now. And those are the most exciting connections, the ones you didn't know in advance. Like if you planned it all out, that can be amazing too, maybe happening at some other point where the association happened, but I love where you don't know. And even now, like I'm reading this, I'm thinking, oh my God, that's weird. There's this scene very early where the child Leopold's mother, who's studying archaeology, is like looking at transparencies of like the sort of development of the species, so like turning all the different skeletons that lay, and I'm like, that's exactly. But of course, like I wrote both of them, it's not an accident that like these patterns appear, but somehow that combination of like all the patterns that are in you you don't know. So like just trying to have like really open time with things, and going over them and seeing. But at an earlier point in the process, I also like chopped the whole thing up into sort of anything that was small enough to be its own segment, sort of incident, and then I ordered them by random procedures, just so I would see it differently, like just to break up my idea. And in my case, that was like part of making it fiction. I had to just change more things, like, which had to do also with intention, like to let go of my original intention, which was, I've now decided was like to prove something, like this happened, you can't deny it. And instead to like discover something that I didn't know yet. And so part of that had to be like, so letting go of whatever my initial intention is a huge part of it. And I think, yeah, the physical thing of like dividing things up into units that you can then move around, especially physically, like, you know, individual, whether you do it by writing note cards that say, you know, the chapter about this, the chapter about that, and move the note cards around, or, you know, have stickies on your wall. I have a good friend, Kate Greenstreet, a poet. I always see pictures that her partner Max sends me. She'll put her entire book on the wall. She just tapes every page, and then she can just move the pages around, and she's like living with them on the wall. So there's that too, like just that sort of, it's just there, so you see it like out of the corner of your eye. And that's the other, like the thing about steeping yourself in your own work. I think I used to like not be as comfortable, like just living inside my own writing, like trusting that it was worth spending time there. But like the more time you spend with it, it will like arrange itself is really like a deep feel. But you have to be willing to like, if you're going to be intimate with it, you have to like spend time with it. You can't just have the idea that you're going out with your writing, but you never actually call it on the phone and say, let's hang out. Something like that. So I don't know, does that answer? Okay. All right. Well, thank you all so much. If anybody has like another individual question, or come and bug me, but thank you and have a good one.
Tuesday, creative writers, have a great week.
The other three backs. Not being afraid to just include every chapter. And see, oh, that's like part of this too. Without interesting to have today. Not coordinating things off too soon.
Right, yeah. Rather than like, so like this is a book that was about when I was 11 years old, and it doesn't matter.
Or like I've already written the draft and now I just need to edit it.
Right.
Like keeping, I like that keeping the time of composition open is
Yes,
something
yeah.
I like to use. It's also not locked into like the draft idea too much.
Hi. I was just hoping I could ask you a quick question a little bit more